Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of Alex's Afternoon Art Show. Today we are drawing Absolute Zatanna, and I'll be talking a little bit about effects for the most part. This is actually the second time we've drawn Zatanna. I decided I wanted to draw another Absolute character, and regardless of which one I chose, it would have probably been a character I'd already drawn. So I decided to go with Zatanna because I thought this design was a bit more interesting. So yeah, I'll roll the intro and then I'll show you what I have. So, there's actually a few posing things which I should mention before I get too far into anything here. So, I decided, just design-wise, I went through and I shaded everything just so that I knew what everything was supposed to be. I went and I did the sort of fishnet pattern by hand, although I'm not sure whether or not, I might decide to use a pattern brush for that later, although I'm not sure. I might just decide to keep, just do it by hand again, because it'll probably be just as easy, to be honest, and it doesn't really matter too much if it's like a perfect texture or what have you. So yeah, anyways, as I said, there's a few posing things I suppose I should mention first. The hand positions were a bit awkward, a bit awkward to get correct. So this hand is tilted slightly towards the camera, so these fingers should actually be a little bigger than they appear here, and this hand this is a more normal hand position of where the hand is sort of kind of sideways towards the camera, and so that way you can see all the fingers sort of splayed out like that. It's easier. It's a fairly easy hand position. It's whenever you start tilting towards the camera that things start getting a little bit more difficult, because you have to worry a little bit about perspective, which is a consistent and difficult thing to manage. If you get good at it, you never have to worry about it. If it's something you struggle with, you're going to be struggling with it forever. It is a difficult one to deal with. Anyways, so yeah, in terms of sort of, again, standing pose does not necessarily have to be a character standing in an uninteresting way. I decided to have her posed in a weird way because it makes it look a little bit more interesting. So there's a few things like the sort of the hip over here is very, very sort of cocked to the side, extremely obviously, extremely pronounced. So it sort of adds this sort of almost swaying movement to the way that things look. It's a little weird. It's a little off kilter and strange. And that, I think, is in character. Haven't actually read anything she's in. Just seen the design. But yeah. So I tried to stick reasonably close to how she appears in a lot of the interior art of the comics, because in a lot of cover art things vary a little bit more. So I decided to, as I say, stick a little closer to the interior art. So one thing which is inconsistent, and I think I know why, is the eye color. Here I initially drew it in with dark eyes because her eyes are seemingly a sort of a brown, sort of maybe like a medium brown color by default, but whenever she's doing some sort of magic, they go blue. So because I'll probably be giving her magic effects, I'll probably have her eyes be blue. So that will actually be a change that I'll have to do. Hair-wise, her hair in the interior art is a lot curlier, a lot sort of more noticeably curly than it is in a lot of sort of cover art or fan art and things like this. So I'll be going more off of that. So the hair here, it is curly, but it's not quite as curly as it probably should be. There's parts of this I might add a few more curls and a bit more mess to the hair, because in the interior art it is messier. The nose shape is about right, I'd say. Maybe needs to be a bit sort of more pointed. She does have quite a small nose. So the eyebrows are going to be stand to be a little rounder. Yeah, they maybe stand to be a bit rounder. And then yeah, a lot of the design stuff is fairly accurate. This for the spikes, that seems about right. There's not necessarily a defined number, so I've just gone and added a sort of whatever looks satisfying to me. The sort of the chain here that sort of connects around like that, that's accurate enough. Sometimes it's more sort of typical bands like this, and then sometimes it's little sort of beads. I've decided to go with bands because that's easier to draw. And then the sort of the jewelry around the neck, that can get a little inconsistent. Typically, these maybe wouldn't be quite so long. These sort of long bits here, they wouldn't be quite that long. They'd maybe end at about here, normally. That's about the rest of this, and the sort of fishnet shirt would be a little bit more sort of rounded in the neck around here. Wouldn't be quite so low-necked. So I'll change that. And then there's more beads, usually. More sort of beading around here. Yeah. Well, normally she has a bit of a longer neck than what I've drawn her with here, so I might have to adapt to that a little bit. That's one thing I might have to adapt a little bit, just because, yeah, that's not quite so consistent. That's a change which I've made here, which I can't really fix too easily. Then there's the chain around the hip. Is that? Yeah, that's about right. Nothing unusual there. I'm not going to use my chain brush for this, just because I need it to be a specific shape, and I don't want to have to go through and add strokes and all this stuff, because that's a pain. So for this, it's only a few links, so I don't have to worry about it. It's not like I'm drawing a big chain that's sort of swooping around or anything like that, or little individual broken links or what have you, like I did with Superman. So I don't have to worry too much about that. For the most part, the boots and the pants are fairly flat. Like in a lot of the interior art, they are just literally flat black, with no real sort of defined lines or anything on them. Bit of sheen here or there, but that's about all I have to worry about. Yeah, for the most part, it's a very simple design, which I think is probably why it's sort of caught on. But yeah, I don't think there's anything I really have to worry too much about. Yeah, one thing which I was sort of wondering about, I suppose, with this. Yeah, no, it actually not really a thing. I was going to say some of these sort of the body length varies a little bit. Sometimes she seems a little taller, sometimes she seems a little shorter. But I think a lot of that comes down to the size of the boots. The boots have a very thick sole on them, so that makes her look a bit taller. But yeah, effect-wise, a lot of that effect stuff is going to be a later issue. Because I'm looking at some of this, it's a very sort of squiggly kind of magic is usually how it's drawn. Again, I'm going by the interior art here because that's sort of that's kind of the gospel that I'm working off of with this, because the rest of it is sort of a little bit more inconsistent in certain things. So I'll go with what's in the interior art, or yeah, that's usually what I'm going to go by here. So that'll be more consistent, more reliable. But yeah, the magic around the hands is a bit more squiggly. This sort of almost has like a tentacle look to it. So that's probably what I'll try and emulate for that. I'll have to try and think of some brushes to use. I might use some sort of like thin paint brushes for that, and that might give me the idea of that. It'll be one to think about anyways. I'll have to think about that. That'll be a... I'm wondering, will that be a colors situation, or will that be a post-colors situation? I'll probably do that during the color section, just to sort of keep everything condensed into one area. And then, yeah. So yeah, I suppose, yeah, posing-wise, I've already sort of mentioned the sort of little things of just sort of making things a little off-kilter, a little weird. It just makes things look a bit more interesting. She's not normally posed like that in a lot of the interior art. It's not necessarily like weird or off-kilter poses, but I just decided to do that because I thought it might be a bit more interesting. Something just sort of a little off, a little odd. I mean, there's little things like this foot is more far forward, even though this is the sort of the foot where all the weight is. So ordinarily, whenever you would have the foot where all the weight is, that would be the one that'd be angled forward, and then the other foot maybe be a little further back. Here it's the opposite of where I've had. That's at least usually how I draw it, anyways. I usually have here. I've got the. Well, I suppose maybe this foot would be where a lot of the weight is. But anyways, this foot is further forward, but yet this foot is sort of almost angled towards us a little bit more. The leg anyways is, but the foot is sort of tilted away. So it's little weird things like that where that's a little unusual, the way that the sort of legs are posed there. And then the sort of the way the rest of the body is posed, it has this sort of like kind of flowy sort of rounded line to everything. And everything has that sort of like rounded line to it. Nothing is too sort of sharp. Maybe this is a little sharp, the way that her arm is posed there. But a lot of this is sort of, again, smoother, sort of rounded angles, things like that. Makes things look a little bit more sort of like they flow. Makes it look a bit more sort of like a smooth sort of, as I say, swaying pose. But yeah, that's sort of something, just a little interesting little detail, I think. But yeah, I think I've rambled enough about this stuff. I'll probably just do these details and then I'll be back to talk about the colour. So there's a few little things which I'll have to change. Things like I think the jewellery around the neck, I'll have to sort of alter the shape of that a little bit to match closer to what it actually is supposed to look like. The eyes, I'll make the sort of iris sort of a clearer colour because they'll be blue whenever I'm going through. But yeah, those are really the only big changes I have to make to the details, otherwise everything will probably stick as it is. Anyways, I will do this and then I'll be back to talk about the colours. So yeah. Alright, that is our colours. It is now the following day. Or, that is our details, I mean to say. We're about to do the colours. It's the following day. The details took a long time to do. I kind of went in knowing this one was going to be a bit of a longer one. Just because there's a lot of details. There's a few things which I sort of tinkered around with, which I didn't necessarily go with. I decided, I sort of moved around some of these lines on the boots because, as you can see, they were originally a little different. You could originally see the little buttons on the side, but I decided to just conceal that because there's no real need for them to be seen. I think the shape is more interesting if you just see like the little buckles like that. There's no need for them to be seen. You don't necessarily have to show every single detail of a character design at all times. Sometimes it's more interesting if you conceal certain bits. So I changed the shape of the hand here a little bit. I deliberately tried to make the fingers a little bigger because, as I say, the hand is pointed towards the camera. A little bigger, not hugely bigger, because I wanted them to still be a little smaller than this hand, because this hand is further forward than this one. However, this one is facing the camera, which is the difference here. It can be very frustrating to try and manage all these little tiny details. But I digress. I changed the shape of the jewelry. I added there actually is more necklaces here than there was originally because there is supposed to be more necklaces. I just missed one, I think, originally whenever I put it in, and then I put in the sort of the longer, sort of long oval shaped bits more sort of cleanly in their shape. The buttons here on the jacket should probably be smaller, but I don't think that's too important. That is very much a depending on the artist kind of taste thing, I think, that one, because that varies quite wildly, depending on some of the art I'm looking at here. But what I was going off of mostly is the interior art, where they are a tiny bit smaller than what I've done here. But again, as I say, it's not terribly important, but just worth noting. So what else do I have to mention? I did go through and I added in the fishnet pattern by hand, which didn't actually take that long. It's just sort of a cumbersome process. And so yeah, is there anything else I really need to mention? I originally, whenever I drew it in, I put the fishnet pattern over the bra, but apparently that is, from what I'm looking at, in literally every piece of art that I'm looking at here, it's always under, so that's what I've gone with. So originally I put it in just because I figured that would make more sense, but seemingly from what I'm looking at here, it is supposed to be under, so that's what I've gone with. I was going to originally put some patterning here instead, just so there's something going on here, but the bra and the pants are supposed to be flat. They are sort of a flat black. I put a little bit, just even a tiny bit into the pants just to sort of have a little bit more going on. I put a little band here along the top because these types of pants, if they have no sort of like visible seam or anything like that on them, usually there's a band on the top, so that's what I put in instead, and I put a seam along the side just so that there's a bit more going on there, because in some of the other art there is usually a seam along the side. It makes just look a bit more interesting, and the boots usually don't necessarily have a hugely visible seam, but I put one along the side just so that it makes sense visually. And then yeah, obviously the sole and the fairly thick soles on the boots. I didn't make any major changes up here. I made the hair more curly, I fixed the eyes, and yeah, I generally made her hair a lot curlier. And I used sort of messier, thinner, hairier lines just to sort of make it look messy. Because the weight of your lines can determine some of these things. If you use a thicker line on hair, that can make it look more formed, more clean, more sort of defined, which if you're trying to make a character's hair look curly, you wouldn't necessarily use that unless they are very neatly defined curls. Someone who's intentionally curled their hair as opposed to their hair being naturally curly. So in this case, because her hair, as far as I can tell, is supposed to be naturally curly, I have sort of gone through and used thinner, hairier lines, and there's just sort of thicker lines in these sort of general shapes, but you can even see, if I zoom in closely, you can see all these little lines sort of flaring out and messing out in all these little areas, and some bits which are sort of like bunched up and twisted around each other, because that's more natural looking. So that's sort of what I went off of there. And yeah. that's the sort of the major sort of broad strokes of what I did, what I changed, what I did around that stuff. Yeah. So in terms of what we're gonna have to do color-wise, I'm gonna be, as I say, sticking pretty close to the interior art, which means that I'm gonna be using a lot of very heavy black. However, I will, because of the way that some of this shows up in the interior art, some of it shows as sort of shinier materials, some of it doesn't. Sometimes the pants are sort of a shinier material, sometimes they're not. The boots are usually a shinier material, but literally all the other art I'm sort of going off of some of the covers here as well. And in some of the covers, the pants and the bra are a shinier material, so that's what I'll go with. Is I'll have all sort of the black, just so that it's consistent at the very least. All the black will be a sort of a shinier material. So as I say, that is at the very least consistent. Makeup wise, actually, there's some interesting inconsistencies in covers versus interiors. On the interiors, what I can tell, there isn't necessarily a particularly defined. Yeah, there isn't necessarily a particularly defined eyeshadow color in the interiors, but in a lot of the in a lot of the covers, it's a sort of a bluey kind of color. And on the interiors, her lips are a sort of a black with a tiny bit of red, where sometimes on the covers they're black with a tiny bit of blue. We'll see what I feel like when I do it. That one is... It doesn't matter too much. The blue is more consistent with the color theory of the character, so I might go with the blue. That might just work a bit better. But, yeah. So, in terms of the magic effects, that's also something I have to worry about in this section. I'm going to have the gloves be a sort of a light blue and have them be kind of glowing a little bit, because that's what tends to occur. And then I need to have some sort of like twisting kind of tendrily sort of things coming around the hands like that. Because in the interior art, it's very messy. Deliberately so. I don't want to say they're messy even, they're quite defined. They're almost like little tentacles that come around. I mentioned this before. But they're almost like little tentacles that sort of twist around the hand. So that's probably what I'll use as a general idea. They're fairly defined, but I will probably have them be a little messier. I might go in and add a little line after the fact, just so that it almost defines parts of it, but that otherwise it is just sort of like a little glob, for the sake of making my own life a little easier. But yeah. Anyways, I will stop dawdling and I will just do these colors, because this is gonna this one might wind up being a pretty long one. So I'll do these colors and then I'll be back to talk about the shading. Right, so that is our colors and our little bits of magic effects. So it was an enormous pain. As you probably saw me filtering through about 500 different brushes there, tinkering, trying different things. I finally found one which I liked, which is this sort of paintbrush that I used for this. It's mostly sort of a hard sort of edge, but it is sort of it has these sort of bits of cloudiness and sort of thinness in edges and stuff like that, and then you can almost sort of see through it, but it's fairly opaque. I then had to go back through and sort of trace over everything with this sort of lighter blue line, because that is how it looks in the art that this is all based off. So there's ways I could have done this which would have made my life easier. I could have simply, I don't know, done a selection or something like that and then duplicated or something or other like that. I didn't. I did this the hard way, and I hope it was worth it. I think it was, but yeah, so I did that the hard way. I had to tinker with some of the colors as well after the fact, because the blue of the sort of magic was too blue. It needs to have a sort of a whiter kind of hue to it. So I had to tinker with that a few times, and then finally I came up with this, which I like well enough. So yeah, that was a pain. So that is done at least. I don't have to worry about that anymore. But as I say, yeah, it's the sort of, the lines I think are extremely necessary, but also that is how it looks. But yeah, without it, that's what you got, which, no, obviously not good. But yeah, the sort of cloudy sort of white I think works pretty well for this. But yeah, color-wise, I didn't do anything unusual. I tried to use a very dark black, but I'm also conscious that I do have to shade this. So I don't want it to be flat black. But I'm going to try not to overshade it because, well, try not to over lighten it, because it is supposed to be very dark. Like, the black is supposed to be quite dark. So I'm going to try not to use too light a hue. I think I'm probably going to, what I'm kind of going off of here a little bit in terms of, especially with the colors of the background, is there's a particular cover of Absolute Wonder Woman which has Zatanna on it, and she's all lit in blue tones, and then the background is all in red tones. So I've pulled a little bit from that, where there's this sort of red light behind her, and then the sort of edges are in purple. So I'm probably going to stick with sort of bluish tones for the most part. I'll probably have like sort of purpley colors are darkest, and then maybe a pale blue, or I'm almost tempted to use a sort of a pale red for the light, just so that that sort of stands out a little bit more, but I don't want it to be too much. I think the blue might be a smarter choice here, and then just leave the red in the background. And whatever we do with the gradient maps, that'll still sort of look fairly red. But yeah. Anyways, that's the sort of general idea. I'm going to try not to overshade this too much, because some of these colors should remain fairly flat. So what I'm going to do is, for the black, I'm probably not going to do too much to it. With the other colors, I'm going to try and make those a little darker. So yeah, anyways, I'll do that and then I'll be back to do the detail shading and all that other stuff. But yeah. Right, so that is our painted shading done. As I said, I tried not to overdo it a little bit, so much so that I actually lowered the opacity on it. It was originally a little higher, but I decided to lower it because I felt like it was getting just a little too intense. So it's a hue really that I've added to this more than anything else. And so I'm going to be sort of deepening the shading in important areas with the detailed shading, and then sort of not at all touching it. For example, I don't think I'm going to really touch it at all on the black. I'm probably going to put like a dark edge, and that's about it. I decided to go for a sort of middle shading, where there's a sort of a line of light on the middle, and then everything on the outside, the sort of edges are all dark, because that sort of And it's almost like a sort of a weird sort of... It looks like there's a sort of a blue light hitting her directly, and then there's obviously these which are emitting a little bit of blue light, and they're a bit in front of her, so you could say that that's where the blue light is coming from. And then behind her is the sort of red. I don't think I'm going to put a red outliner on her or anything like that, but... You know, yeah, maybe I will, actually. I'll think about that, actually. That's not a bad idea. I might put a red outline on her just because that'll stand out a little bit more, especially if she's got such predominant blue lighting on her. Having the red outline would stand out very clearly as a contrast. So it's not a terrible idea. I might actually do that. But, yeah, the sort of... the red and purple background sort of, she stands out quite a bit now because of all the sort of the blue, obviously the natural blue tones that she's got in her design, and then also now the extra blue hue of the sort of the shading. Which, as I say, I'm going to make it a little darker with the detailed shading, and then I'll add our light line, which I'm thinking might be red now. And then our gradient maps will sort of polish those things up. However, I do need to still sort of add in those little bits of sort of sheen and stuff like that. The lips will need a little bit of that. The sort of, yeah, all this stuff. All the black will need that little bit of sheen. But I won't go too crazy with it, because it should still be sort of subtle within some respect. So yeah, I'll try not to go too crazy with it. But yeah, anyways, I will move on. I'll do this detailed shading, the outline, all that stuff. And then I will do the last few gradient maps and wrap up. Yeah. Right, so that is our detailed shading, our last little bits of lighting, and our light line, as well as our first gradient map. So I decided to do something a bit weird with the gradient map. I've been getting a little bit weirder with these gradient maps recently. I don't know if you've noticed. That's if you've been watching, that is. So I went for the sort of the sort of purple at the end, the light blue at the other end, but at the middle I decided to put in a pinky tone, just so that that red doesn't get sort of completely washed out by the blues. And so I decided to artificially darken it by putting another darker layer here, and then one right next to it as well. Both of these are around the sort of medium purple to sort of leaning a little pink. And then our next tone just after that is another blue. So sort of medium light and light are both blue. Exact dead middle is pink, and then all our darker tones are purple. So that's sort of the way that that hues out there. I mean, you can even see here some of these are a little bit more different. But yeah, sort of the way this all sort of works out. I mean, even this pink is very bright, but all of these tones here are like right at the bottom. So it just means that all our lighter tones are very bright, all our darker tones are very dark. High contrast. I like how that looks. I always like high contrast. So I've gone for a soft light at 70%, and that's sort of how it looks. The sort of red in the background gets a lot redder, and other contrasts sort of get darker, which is good. Again, we want the contrast, that's what looks good here. So let's start making our duplicates. So let's go for luminosity. This is going to get a bit dimmer, and here it's actually sort of brought a lot of the red back. Surprisingly, it's focused a lot on the red, so we're going to turn that down quite a bit. I think 20%, because we do want it to be darker, and the luminosity will make it darker. So, right, now next on the agenda, very curious to see how color burn is going to look on this. It's very blue, which is good. We want blue. Because that brings up our, wait, we bring that all the way up. Yeah, it's very strong. So we're going to want to put that maybe 15%, because it makes the background a lot darker. but it also makes our blue a lot more present. It sort of crushes everything that isn't that highest color. So, right. And I'm thinking we might be able to get away with something else here. Multiply? What about multiply? What would that do for us? It just sort of deepens everything that exists. Sort of brings out a lot of the highlights a little bit more though. Nice sort of change. What about hue? What does hue do for us? Sort of mostly puts everything within the realm of our normal colors. Kind of don't want. Doesn't really make anything more interesting. Just sort of crushes everything down to the shades of purple. So maybe saturation. How does that look? That's actually, I think, exactly what we want. Maybe a little too vivid. I'll bring it down to 20%. All very blue. It actually doesn't touch that red in the background almost at all. It's actually exactly kind of what we want in that respect, where it just sort of makes the blues a little bit brighter and the red is kind of left alone. I think a saturation layer is actually good for us. No, color doesn't do it. Saturation. No. 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 No, none of these are it. The rest of these are just going to sort of make it darker. Just going to make it darker, which we don't really need. It's already dark enough, I'd say. So yeah, saturation I think is actually a smart choice here because it's just subtle. Subtle, little bit of extra blue. So we're into the 4 gradient map territory. It's normally not something I would do, but well, here we are. Yeah, I normally wouldn't do that just because I find that it can get a little sort of overly saturated, a little too much going on. It can start to look a little deep fried, which it's for some people's tastes, but not really mine. I don't normally like when things start getting a bit deep fried. It doesn't really look good to me. So I usually don't go for that. But yeah, our texture here will lighten things up a little bit. I'm actually probably going to leave this a little higher, maybe 20%. How does that look on 20%? Sort of lightens things up a little bit in a few places. See, part of the reason why I always put the texture on last is because I don't want it to become part of that sort of like deep fried thing, because it starts to get really present whenever you put it below those gradient maps. Something which I've never particularly addressed, but it starts to get really messy and things like that in areas like this. I put it over everything just so that it doesn't really get affected by the lighting. Because, again, as I say, it can get very messy whenever it starts getting into that territory. So yeah, that is kind of everything for the most part. I talked a lot in this one, whether that be about, you know, the posing stuff at the start and then the details and design, which I suppose that's interesting for some people, I imagine. And then I talked a lot about the color stuff and about sort of balancing out the sort of different design elements in color. And then the effects were, despite being an intentional focus, didn't actually focus on them all that much. I wound up talking about a whole bunch of other stuff instead. But I mean, I'm happy with how the effect came out. The reason why I use a lot of paintbrushes on a lot of effects and stuff like that is so that it has a sort of a natural kind of fade and glow to it, because whenever you're using paintbrushes, it will sort of fade out around the edges and stuff like this unless you're using a very hard brush. I don't usually use very hard paintbrushes. I usually use sort of watercolor texture, of where it's sort of imitation watercolor, for lack of a better term. And so that's usually what I work around with these. So it has this sort of nice sort of glow to the edges. I add an outer glow and stuff like that as well a lot of the time. But for the sake of this, it sort of comes out as these sort of nice little feathered edges and stuff like that you see here. And then I obviously went in and added the extra line. But yeah, it's something which I do anyways with the a lot of these sort of effects and things like that, because I think it just looks a bit better. Sometimes I will just pencil it in by hand, but sometimes I just find that, or most of the time I find that just using effects like this, it looks a lot better whenever it's painted in. It draws a separation between the way that the character is drawn and the way that the effects are done. So it at least makes things stand out and look different. Especially given that I very, very rarely draw environments, it helps to sort of give things a little bit more going on, because you obviously would draw an environment a little different than you draw a character. But for time, I find that drawing an environment doesn't take that long, but for the fact that I'm already spending so long drawing the character, I don't want to have that as well. This is usually why I don't bother. But yeah. Anyways, this was a fun one. I quite enjoyed doing this. I think it came out pretty well. Kind of came out exactly as I wanted it to, which is a rare thing, but it works. Usually whenever I'm doing one of these, I usually have to sort of accept that the idea in my head is not going to be what winds up on the on screen. But this time, more or less actually exactly kind of what I wanted, which works pretty well for me. But yeah. Anyways, I think I've rambled long enough. This is probably going to wind up being a pretty long one in the edit, just because I talked so much in this one. Talked a little bit more than I usually do anyways. But yeah, I'll just wrap up, and then that way I won't have as much work to do. Anyways, if you like the video, do whatever it is that you'd normally do, whether that be liking it or not. I would of course prefer if you did like it, but I can't make you do that, so all I can do is politely suggest it, which I believe I have done. It's the same deal. If you want to subscribe, go for it. I'd of course like that, but I can't make it, so do as you would. I'd of course prefer if you did subscribe. You can click the button below the video if you want to do that. You already knew that though. If you have any suggestions for what you'd like to see me draw in the future, you could leave those in the comments. The art show is ending soon, so you can leave them soon. Although if there's good suggestions down there, I might come back and do more sort of randomly, but those are not going to be reliable. Those are not going to be reliable or regular uploads in any respect. And yeah, if you choose to watch the next video, I will see you next time. So, with all that said, there's us. I will say goodbye and I will leave you. So, bye-bye.